a golfer to appreciate it, but Club Pro Guy is this social media star. It's like a spoof character, but his videos are hysterical, and he does really good satire. Talk about a dying art. Well, finally, the teachers' unions are the stuff of punchlines, long overdue. And they were implicitly the target of the latest mailbag session from Club Pro Guy. Somebody had written in about his instruction and why it was only virtual.
Hey everybody, Club Pro Guy here, coming to you live from the Learning Center. It's mailbag time. Today's first question comes from Janice Schaefer right here in Kansas City. And Janice writes, CPG, in late December, my husband Jerry purchased a year-long game improvement package from you for our son Easton. It's now mid-March and Easton still hasn't been able to schedule an in-person lesson with you yet. What gives? It's a great question, Janice, and the short answer is, like most teachers in this country, I still don't feel comfortable for my own safety teaching in person, so I'm just going to go ahead and refuse to do my job while still getting paid. Now, I have sent Easton a few random George Gankis YouTube links, so he is learning virtually, which I think we've all established by now is good enough.
Yeah, and I'm on the waiting list to get into a Club Pro Guy's new club, 3 Jack National, which is very exclusive, as I understand.
Yes. Now I'm following him on Twitter.
Yeah, he's the best. I mean, the guy.
He does one about March Madness too. I want to watch
hysterical. He is so good. Punchline. The teachers' union position is a punchline for YouTube stars. So should this article in the Wall Street Journal be a punchline. Home buyers are heading to Florida during COVID, but nearly as many as are moving out. Oh, really? You know, it's so interesting, right? You got the emphasis initially was undermine Sweden because they're not going along with the lockdown orthodoxy. Now it's, all this, everybody is flooding out of Manhattan and Chicago and elsewhere to go to Florida, Southwest Florida or Scottsdale. Yeah. Oh, no, we got to undermine that narrative. No, it's not really happening. Florida's not really a growth state. No, it's not really good down there. Interesting. I mean, take a look at home prices year over year and the spike. That says something. And take a look at them in those areas where people are fleeing, as previously described.
And houses aren't even on the market for a day in some places.
This is such shoddy journalism. The reliance on one moving company survey, Atlas Van Lines survey, and the CEO, the COO there says, kind of surprised me because all the news stories about how people are there's overrun. There's a flooding of Florida going on in terms of people. Well, a good response from the Florida Chamber of Commerce Foundation's chief economist to this article. Florida is growing at around a net of 800 to 900 people per day.
800 to 900 a day?
Yeah. Most people who move into or out of Florida do not use the moving company you source in your story. So let me correct the incorrect assertion in the article. What's actually true is that substantially more people are moving to Florida from other states than leaving Florida. This has been true for a long time. All you have to do is check data from the U.S. Census Bureau. Every year, Census releases state-to-state migration data. It will show you that since 2012, 278,000 plus more people have moved to Florida from New York than left Florida to move to New York. It's the number one state for in-migration in Florida, followed by New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. It's no coincidence that the high-tax states are the ones with the highest net migration to Florida. What is actually true is that Florida is a large net gainer of population in both interstate and international moves every year. Since 2015, Florida has created more than 1 of 11 new jobs in the United States, and it's projected to grow by 4 million residents by 2030. It's also why, just again here, it's so silly, this article. Explain to me, if as many people are moving out as moving in, why Florida is scheduled to gain 1, probably 2 congressional seats after the 2020 census. That's a joke. But the point is to say
Well, they're not reporting; they're promoting their narrative.
Correct. We got to undermine Florida. DeSantis could be a presidential nominee in 2024. Let's see if we can knock him out in his reelection in 2022. Let's get on it. You got to, pour water on the story that Florida is this economic engine. Florida did it right, and with each passing day that DeSantis's position is faring well relative to lockdowners, emphasis on downers, Cuomo, Pritzker, Whitmer, etc., Newsom. With each passing day, it makes it more and more difficult. So you better get to work on that DeSantis guy and what's happening in Florida so that the people properly misunderstand the lessons. For more on all this, we're pleased to be joined by John Tierney again. He's a contributing editor at City Journal, former reporter and columnist at the New York Times, author of The Power of Bad, How the Negativity Effect Rules Us and How We Can Rule It. John, thanks for being with us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me, Dan.
Well, I mean, we'll get to your piece, which really focuses on deaths from COVID versus lockdown, the sort of excess deaths conversation that's happening now globally. But, I mean, just as a former New York Times reporter as well, this Wall Street Journal story relying on one moving company survey to try to cast the situation in Florida in terms of net in-migration as something it isn't.
Yeah, I mean, there's this whole tendency, the media just bought into this narrative that lockdowns were the answer, and they had just resisted any evidence that showing that in fact the lockdowns there's still no good evidence that the lockdown saved any lives, and they've inflicted enormous economic damage and death, as I wrote in City Journal. And what you're saying about Florida, I mean, the great comparison there is with California, where Florida was supposed to have disaster when it reopened last year, and California was the model. It was the strictest state in the country, strictest lockdown. And they did last year have a relatively low rate of COVID mortality, but then they had this big winter outbreak. And the best measure of what the pandemic is doing and what lockdowns are doing is to look at how many more deaths there were than normal. All deaths, altogether with what they call excess deaths. And Florida is below the national average in that, and they're way below California, which is which is significantly above the national average. So their lockdowns have not prevented deaths; they've caused more deaths. And it's really striking. I mean, what's really awful about the lockdowns is that they've had this disproportionate impact on younger people, on minorities, on low-income workers, and you see that in these statistics. Florida, younger people in Florida have done much better than younger people in California as far as who has died, and you also see this in Sweden. They got knocked. The narrative was that they were killing people by not locking down, but Sweden and its neighbors, Finland and Norway, who for most of last year followed the same policies as Sweden. Schools were open, businesses were open, people were not wearing masks, and all those countries have done much better, especially among young people, than the rest of Europe. Sweden's excess mortality is lower than the United States, and in fact, while the United States had this big surge in excess deaths among younger people, in Sweden the deaths are lower than normal. So it's really an indictment of these lockdown policies.
Well, explain the excess deaths for younger people. What were they dying from?
Well, when I say younger people, it's through middle-aged people too. But there were so many things. People were not getting medical treatment. There were more fatal heart attacks because people weren't getting, seeking treatment. Researchers predicted there would be tens of thousands of deaths of despair, as they call it. That's from alcoholism, from fatal drug overdoses, from suicide. And, because you didn't, suddenly the drug treatment programs were shut down, alcohol sales surged. It was that people thought, well, at least one day we'll have fewer traffic deaths because nobody's driving. In fact, what happened, there was a lot less driving last year. We had the highest number of people killed on the highways in more than a decade. And it's because there was more drinking, more drugs, and more high-speed driving on closed roads. So, just the impact, economists have really documented that when you have a big surge in unemployment, it just exacts this real social toll, and you eventually see more deaths from that because, people have lost their jobs, they've lost their businesses, they start drinking more, they start engaging, and they give up. And so we saw that, and there was one study I cited in this article that the number of people killed, the number of excess deaths, the number of deaths above normal, was especially high in counties that were poor people and more minorities. And these deaths, were not due to COVID; they were due to other causes.
Just talking about those excess deaths, which you peg at about 130,000 per CDC numbers. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford said lockdowns are the single worst public health mistake in the last 100 years, and the implication is that these excess deaths is a good indicator of just how bad a mistake it was, particularly against the comparison of how many lives lockdowns allegedly saved. There's no real calculation on that, and perhaps that's purposeful so that people from, frankly, Donald Trump to Joe Biden can say it was going to be 2.1 million dead according to some, phony baloney modeling from Neil Ferguson across the pond. And look, it's so much less than that. That speaks to how effective our policies were. Now, Trump is not using that in terms of the lockdowns, but he is saying it generally speaking, starting from the premise of that model, which I think is a dubious premise from which to start. And so now you see the same thing happening. But for the lockdowns, what was modeled would have happened, and that's why we don't have to quantify the costs and benefits of the lockdowns.
Well, they just ignored that whole calculation. There have been more than 24 studies where, in various ways where they've looked at two comparable places, and one with a lockdown, one without. And what they keep finding over and over is that the pattern of infection, tends to be about the same in both places. And when you look, for instance, at the 50 states and you rank them according to how stringent their lockdown was, with California at the top and Florida near the bottom, you find there's one clear pattern that the stricter the lockdown, the higher the unemployment rate. But there's no pattern, when you look at COVID mortality, who had a higher rate or not. But those numbers have just, gotten ignored, by the media, and they've really, and no one has really stopped and looked at what's the overall impact of this. How many people are being killed by lockdowns, how many are being saved. And there's no evidence that the lockdown saved any lives, and we know that they're killing people. And as I say in the City Journal piece, if a corporation behaved this way, if they continued to sell a drug or a medical treatment that had no proven benefit and known fatal side effects, the executives of that corporation would be facing lawsuits, they'd be facing bankruptcy, and they'd probably be facing criminal charges. But the government officials who've done this, they still have never done cost-benefit analyses. They've never looked at the big picture. They just said, we locked down and it must have worked, so we're going to keep locking down.
He is John Tierney, contributing editor to City Journal, former reporter and columnist at the New York Times, co-author of the book, The Power of Bad, How the Negativity Effect Rules Us and How We Can Rule It, which I highly recommend, as I do his column, Death and Lockdowns, which I'll tweet out. John, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
You're listening to Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan